Okay, and we're live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this very exciting event where we are officially launching the Labor Provisions in Trade Agreements Hub, otherwise known as the LP Hub. The Hub is a one-stop shop for information on labor provisions in more than 100 regional trade agreements in over 140 economies. The launch of the Hub, the LP Hub, piggybacks off the demand from governments, employers, and workers' organizations for more research, including comparative legal analysis about labor provisions. For this reason, this unique tool offers us a central data source to navigate and analyze labor provisions across trade partners and over time, visualizing trends, searching specific terms, and downloading all the relevant information we need. The LP Hub is a project of the ILO with the support of the European Commission and the Government of Flanders. Before I hand over to Rick Salmons, Director of ILO Research, for his welcoming remarks, let me quickly run through a couple of technical points for today's session. We encourage attendees to submit their questions in the Q&A box, and we promise to do our best to address them to the speakers. For all panelists, we encourage you to keep yourself muted while you're not speaking to avoid any interference. Just to let you know, the meeting will be recorded and shared on our ILO channels. All this said, I thank you once more, and I will hand over to Rick Salmons, Director of ILO Research, for his opening remarks. Rick, you have the floor.
Thanks, Alessandro, and good day, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We've been preparing this for quite some time. And let me just say on behalf of the ILO, we're very pleased with your interest in this Labor Provisions and Trade Agreements Hub. It's a project of the Research Department of the ILO, and I would like to reiterate our appreciation to the Flanders government and the European Commission for their support of this work. This tool was developed by my colleagues, our researchers, but with an understanding of the needs of the ILO's constituents who are seeking to analyze and understand trade agreements that include labor provisions. That's why, for this project, we consulted with over 35 experts, including officials from trade and labor ministries, employers and workers' organizations, and ILO colleagues in different parts of the organization, as well as academic experts at the forefront of research in this area. This multifaceted group of experts provided guidance and support and advice on matters such as the methodology we've applied, the location of the documents that are embedded in this database, the design of the database itself, and how users might most be interested in using the information. Indeed, the Hub is the most comprehensive database available on labor provisions and trade agreements. And we expect that it'll be the main source of information on the text of labor provisions and post-ratification documents available. We're pleased with the final product, hope you will be as well, and we'll find it of utility in your day-to-day work or in your longer-term research and consideration of these issues. Before we get started with the actual presentation of the Hub and its features, let me just take a few steps back and say a few words about the research that underpins the Hub. And this work in various dimensions, which I'll briefly outline, builds on more than a decade-long experience of the department and our collaborators in labor provisions and trade agreements. For example, in 2009, our colleagues published a chapter on labor provisions in the more general World of Work report that the ILO puts out. That chapter took stock of all labor provisions in international trade agreements based on their conditional and promotional elements. We followed this up in 2013 with the publication of the Social Dimensions of Free Trade Agreements report, which provided an exhaustive mapping of the design of labor provisions based on the three-pillar definition that has become the ILO's standard framework for organizing our work and thinking about labor provisions in these agreements. And it is one that has been picked up and is widely used in the literature now. And then between 2016 and 2019, we published 3 widely regarded reports on labor provisions in such agreements: the assessment of labor provisions in trade and investment agreements, the companion handbook, and the labor provisions in G7 trade agreements report. Through this body of research, we have understood better how these provisions strengthen the framework conditions for decent work, using both econometric and comparative legal analysis, along with selected case studies on a country basis. But this research, I should say, is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the work the ILO is actually doing on labor provisions. We as an institution have a long history, as many of you will know, in trade, labor, and employment issues, starting from the institution's creation in 1919. And there are multiple parts of the organization, different departments that are involved in this activity, which ranges from providing advice and technical expertise throughout different phases of the trade agreement to development cooperation projects that are carried out either by our technical departments or field offices. And the goal here overall is to advance decent work in its 4 pillars that include, among other things, the fundamental principles and rights at work and social dialogue. One important feature of the hub that can support this work is to enable policymakers, researchers, and social partners to understand the role that ILO instruments, among others, play in trade agreements. It allows the ILO to consistently monitor and analyze the weight of these instruments in trade policy and identify priority areas in cooperation with other stakeholders. And indeed, I can tell you, as we are going to be active users of this hub, as we progress our work and trying to find a better interrelationship with, mutually reinforcing relationship between the progress in decent work and the investments that are necessary to make that happen on the one hand, and the ongoing integration of economies around the world. Indeed, it's our hope that the hub will be a useful tool for furthering debate on trade and international trade and investment and labor, and indeed encourage other research on the labor dimension thereof. So with that, back to Alessandro, and I look forward to your comments based on the presentation of the hub today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. Let me pause for a second before we continue and share a video that gives an overall background for how the LP Hub came to be.
Trade is the world's engine for economic growth and prosperity. It creates jobs, increases productivity, and has made the world more prosperous and interconnected. But trade also creates winners and losers. It comes with labor market challenges, such as increasing wage inequality and informal and exploitative work. Now, more and more countries are using trade policy to address these challenges and advance decent work. And as a result, labor provisions in trade agreements are more common. 1/3 of all trade agreements include labor provisions. Labor provisions are obligations in trade agreements to protect and advance workers' rights, including through different forms of cooperation and dialogue between trade unions, business organizations, and the general public. As the main authority on labor issues, the ILO provides advice and technical expertise on the design, implementation, and enforcement of these labor provisions upon request of its members. The ILO also provides evidence-based research on trends and effectiveness of labor provisions. In this context, the ILO Research Department's Globalization team has developed the new Labor Provisions in Trade Agreements Hub. The Hub is a unique one-stop shop for information on labor provisions in more than 100 regional trade agreements in some 140 economies. These labor provisions are a tool for promotion and compliance of labor obligations. They are based on 3 pillars: commitment to labor obligations, monitoring and cooperation frameworks to promote compliance, and dispute settlement mechanisms to ensure compliance with the obligations. It's continuously updated and provides user-friendly, easily accessible information so users can navigate and analyze labor provisions across countries extract data and trends, explore thematic areas, search specific terms, and download relevant data. The Hub also improves understanding of how countries design and implement labor provisions, how they've evolved, and what activities are taking place. And it consolidates information on activities, disputes, and the engagement of different actors, including workers and employers' representatives. That's the ILO Labor Provisions Hub, your main data source for information, research, and legal and country analysis of labor provisions in trade agreements for policymakers, experts, civil society advocates, trade unionists, and employers' representatives. For more information, go to www.ilo.org/LPHub.
I hope everyone could see that and hear that all right. Thanks again to all those involved in the production of this excellent video. Just as a reminder to everyone, we will be sharing the live link to the LP Hub as well as the landing page that has links to all the relevant publications and other useful resources, including informational videos. Let me now hand the floor over to Marva Corley-Poulibaly, Chief of the Globalization, Competitiveness, and Labor Standards Units at the ILO and Program Lead. Marva, over to you.
Thank you, Alessandro. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So we asked a group of experts, and these experts included academics, policymakers, trade unionists, employer representatives, and NGOs. We asked them, what is the main database or what is the main tool that you use to search and analyze labor provisions in trade agreements? And do you know what the overwhelming majority responded? Google. That's right. 80% of the experts that we interviewed said Google was their primary tool for searching labor provisions and analyzing the text and labor provisions. So I'd like to say that we're here to replace Google. So I'd like to tell you a few things about the usefulness of the Labor Provisions Hub. But before I do, let me start just by giving you a bit of background about the motivation that we had for this tool. One issue that we at the ILO, at least from a research perspective, we've been asked a lot about is what is the effectiveness of labor provisions? And effectiveness both from an institutional level in terms of changing labor laws and legislation, ratification of ILO conventions, institutional capacity building, as well as effectiveness on the ground in terms of improving working conditions in the lives of the average worker, as well as advancing labor rights. The second thing we're asked in terms of effectiveness is, okay, now what works for effectiveness with respect to labor provisions? Is it the language? Or is something about the design of the language in the labor provisions, hard versus soft language? Is it related to the specific mechanisms in the trade agreement? So dispute settlement mechanisms, whether there are sanctions or whether there are not sanctions. Does it have to do with cooperative activities or committee meetings that involve stakeholder representatives? So with this idea in mind, it's the reason why we created or developed the Hub in collaboration with our Infotech department. As already has been said, the Hub brings together a wealth of information on trade agreements that include labor provisions, and it does so in a user-friendly textualized database. And we do not assign weights or values to the text, which means that you can analyze the text across trade agreements. A couple of things have already been said about the format that we use to categorize the text in the Hub based on the ILO's three-pillared definition. And I call this the 3 C's. This commitment to the obligation, cooperation, and dialogue. And here is where, in terms of the Labor Provision Hub, we have an added value in terms of other resources because we include the information with respect to the institutional frameworks in the trade agreements for dialogue, as well as the documents and relevant information that's available that's related to the trade agreement. We also include, in terms of the categorization, compliance, and that's compliance with the commitments that's set out in the labor provision. So the text is related to this, is organized into these three categories and further categories, as you will see in the demonstration that will follow this presentation. But before that happens, I'd just like to run you through a little bit of the usefulness of the Labor Provision Hub for our stakeholders. And there are four key aspects to this usefulness. The first one is the usefulness for researchers, academics, and the general public who are interested in tracking trends in labor provisions using regularly updated information. So for example, we know that as of December 2021, there are 104 trade agreements that contain labor provisions. And this information is regularly updated on a quarterly basis with the information from the WTO database. In addition, you can construct this information yourself, download the data, and have full information on the labor provisions and trade agreements. The added value of this is it gives a layer of transparency in terms of what the decision-making process is with respect to which trade agreements have labor provisions, which do not. And it also builds confidence in terms of the indicators. The second area of usefulness of the Labor Provisions Hub, in particular for civil society representatives, including workers and employers representatives, is a better understanding of cooperation and dialogue activities that take place under the trade agreement. We've included links to meetings and reports of committees, as well as the public consultation meetings and advisory group meetings. We've also included submissions of violations under the trade agreement, both those withdrawn and accepted. And we include action plans and projects that have been implemented in the context of the trade agreement. However, I'd like to note that this has exposed a really critical area where more work is needed. In some cases, not all, but in a number of cases, it was quite challenging to locate the relevant documents and information related to the activities that took place in the trade agreements. And you'll notice that in some areas of the database, it still says that it's under construction. So we hope that this exercise of putting together the Labor Provisions Hub will help to make information more transparent and will provide an opportunity for more documents to be made available. The third useful area of the Labor Provisions Hub is for policymakers in particular, and that is in supporting the alignment of the labor obligations under the trade agreement with the international system of ILO labor standards. ILO conventions and major principles and declarations are really a very common and important feature of references in trade agreements. And normally this is the case in obligations where you'll see that domestic laws and legislations are, the obligations are referred to as being consistent with obligations that are ratified under ILO conventions or with respect to specific declarations. So for example, about 70% of labor provisions in trade agreements refer to the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. And one reason for this is because member states do commit to respect and promote the principles and rights of the ILO Fundamental Principles and Declaration. Another 1/3 of labor provisions in trade agreements refer to ILO Fundamental Conventions and the progress towards ratification thereof. Finally, and this is also for policymakers, but also for institutions at a global level and for development cooperation agencies, the Hub is a useful tool for finding entry points on labor issues in particular. So for example, in the figure that you see here, over half of trade agreements with labor provisions have explicit references to areas such as occupational safety and health, where almost 70% of trade agreements with labor provisions refer to protection of workers or safe work, eradication of child labor and forced labor, and then other issues such as corporate social responsibility, gender, youth, as well as ethnic and racial groups. Often we can find these references in the cooperation chapter or within the cooperation area of labor or the specialized chapter of the trade agreement. So this could really be an important area where you can find an entry point for enhancing synergies between the cooperation activities that are already taking place within the trade agreement, and new activities that are being considered by development or other international organizations. So what is the future of the Labor Provisions Hub? And we're just launched and we're already talking about the future, but I'd just like to let you know that the Labor Provisions Hub is not a static tool, it's dynamic. And so you'll see in the future how it's growing. We expect to add research papers and reports linked to labor provisions and trade agreements, as well as ILO committee documents that are publicly available, where there tend to be discussions on issues with respect to labor issues under trade agreements, as well as links to relevant ILO development cooperation activities. We'll include as well links to relevant databases on trade patterns within specific countries, as well as normative databases. But most of all, we welcome your contributions and suggestions, and we ask that you take a look at the database, view the information and features, and let us know how we can improve. So if you contact us directly at this email address, which Alessandra will put in the chat, we'll get back to you and we'll really look forward to your comments. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues for a demonstration of the hub. Thank you.
So here it is. Welcome to Labor Provisions and Trade Agreements Hub. We are delighted to be launching today this dynamic tool, as Marvin has said, of the world of more than 100 trade agreements with labor provisions. The hub has been conceptualized as an interactive mapping of labor provisions. At a first glance, as you can see, the map shows a global overview of a number of trade agreements with labor provisions. This is indicated by the blue gradient, which shows the number of trade agreements with labor provisions. Most of the trade partners do include them. However, some of the trade partners didn't include any labor provisions in their trade agreements, which we indicated in gray. By default, the starting year is 1994, which is the first binding labor provision included under NAFTA. However, labor provisions in Trade Agreement Hub is including all labor provisions and all trade agreements notified to WTO, which is total of 351 RTAs as of 2021. Just one moment. The text table underneath the map provides a list of trade agreements based on selected filters. It's important to note that the filters are restricted. So for instance, if choosing in trade partner filter a region, African region, for instance, the trade agreement filter indicates only trade agreements related to these specific countries. Also, the table below is updated to 41 trade agreements. So while the map shows us a comparative analysis between trade partners and region, the trend graph indicates the evolution of trade agreements over time. Since 1994, the trade agreements have increased with labor provisions have increased to 104 trade agreements with labor provisions out of 351 trade agreements. We can also zoom only to trade agreements with labor provisions as well as specific year, which is showing which trade agreements have come into force in that specific year. Finally, we also can download the figure specific to the graph or for the map. An important feature of the hub is the reset button in case you want or you get lost on the hub. Additionally, labor provisions in trade agreements have become increasingly comprehensive. A key feature of a database is the classification into the three main pillars, which lets you delve more into the granularity of the data and the nuances of a text. The number of labor provisions do not reflect their level of obligation. To explore that, the obligation pillar lays out domestic labor laws, international instruments such as conventions and declarations, as well as thematic areas, which we can see down here. So for instance, a user is interested to know what trade agreements have included restrictive labor provisions that prohibit the activities of trade partners. One can look at the commitment to not derogate, waive, lower labor laws, or act in a protectionist manner. If we select this category, we see that a total of 78 RTAs do include these provisions. We could further narrow down our search and look what trade agreements have included provisions specific to do not act in protectionist manner. So I'll be searching in the text box, protectionist. And we see 32 trade agreements do include the text related to this provision. And we can also analyze under which articles or chapters is included this provision. Now, let's analyze the labor obligations from the perspective of a trade partner. For instance, Canada. We see that the table below gets updated with the list of trade agreements that Canada has signed. The table is updated as well as the labor obligations included in their trade agreements. The yellow lines indicate the trade partners. So if we are choosing, for instance, one, we can see that Canada and New Zealand are trade partners within the framework of CPTPP. Also, as you notice, the labor obligations updated again. And if we want to analyze more closely what is the text of this agreement and also navigate the menu, we can do it on this secondary page, which allows us to see an information box of a trade agreement, as well as expand the text or download the filtered text. However, we can analyze the text and compare across various trade agreements within the text table below. If we select a specific labor obligation or category. So I'll analyze now, choose gender. And we can see that we can expand the text within the table and do an initial comparison of the text across different trade agreements. Although it's very important to note that the thematic areas, even though they are in the obligation pillar, we can also identify it in different chapters. So for instance, labor or investment chapter, as well as cooperation activities. And furthermore, Canada has specific chapters on trade and gender. In order to further analyze and delve into the second and third pillar, I'll turn now to my colleague Gaia. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. Can you all correctly see my screen? I hope so. Okay, we will move now to an exploration of monitoring and cooperation. An aspect of monitoring and cooperation that many of our constituents are interested in is engagement of social partners. How can the hub help you find out, for example, how many RTAs engage workers and employers representatives in cooperation activities and/or in institutional mechanisms? We click on monitoring and cooperation, then on cooperation activities and areas. We see that 99 RTAs mention cooperative activities and areas in the field of labor. What we want to do is look for references to workers and employers representatives in these 99 RTAs that contain cooperative activities. The way we do this is through the search bar located just above the text table. Now, based on previous searches on our part, we know that searching the term workers would bring up references that are not strictly related to social partners. On the other side, searching the term social partners would bring a very small number of results because not all RTAs use this specific term. We know instead that if we search the term employers, we obtain references strictly related to social partners. So we type in employers. And we obtain 39 results. This means that 39 RTAs engage social partners in cooperative activities. We can look at examples by scrolling down the text table. For example, our first example is EU-UK, Article 8.3, and we see that the search term is highlighted in yellow. If we collapse EU-UK, we see that the next example is UK-Canada. Now, remember, what we are looking for is how many RTAs engage social partners in cooperation activities and/or in institutional mechanisms. We have just done the cooperative activities part, so now we have to do the institutional mechanisms part. The most efficient way to go about this is understanding first whether there are RTAs that engage social partners in both cooperative activities and institutional mechanisms. To do that, we change this button from or to and we add institutional mechanisms, the current selection. 16 RTAs contain both cooperative activities and institutional mechanisms. However, if we type employers, just a second, there's a lot of data here. We see that there are no results. And this means that at the moment, no RTAs engage workers and employers' representatives in both cooperative activities and institutional mechanisms. But are there RTAs that engage workers and employers' representatives in either cooperative activities or institutional mechanisms? To discover that, we bring the button back to or, and we search for employers again. It's normal if it takes a while to search. Again, there's a lot of data here. Okay, we get that 52 RTAs engage social partners in either cooperative activities or institutional mechanisms. Now, to understand which type of engagement, you would have to go through each RTA. And this is really the benefit of our database over a coded database. Upon performing a complex search like this one, you can read the text of the relevant labor provisions straight from the search results and compare it across RTAs. Another piece of information academics and policymakers might be interested in is how many times committees with social partners in civil society have met under an RTA that establishes them, and perhaps also obtaining the relevant documents without spending too much time digging for them. Is this possible with the hub? Sure it is. We click down here on councils, committees, reports, and meetings. And we find 42 RTAs. We pick one as an example, could be EU-Korea. If we expand it, we find all links of reports of meetings of committees, including the Trade and Sustainable Development Committee, which deals with labor issues. We regularly update these documents. We move now to an exploration of dispute settlement. A hot topic for research on labor provisions is how many RTAs provide for dispute settlement for labor disputes. The Hub offers valuable information on this topic through the first subcategory of dispute settlement mechanism called recourse for labor dispute. It contains provisions indicating whether dispute settlement mechanisms are available for labor disputes and under which part of the agreement, the labor or specialized chapter, or the general dispute settlement chapter. Provisions found under this subcategory do not describe procedures. They simply specify the availability of procedures and, where applicable, their conditionality. How can this subcategory be used practically? Suppose that you want to find how many RTAs contain mechanisms to settle labor disputes in the specialized chapter, which could be the labor chapter or the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter. We see that right now, this is the case for 61 RTAs, over 104 with labor provisions. To get a better idea of how recourse to dispute settlement is presented in a specific RTA, you can either expand an RTA through this arrow or click on it. In US Colombia, for example, we see that the same provision, Article 17.7, counts as both available under the labor chapter and available under the general dispute chapter. Why? Because per the article itself, the procedures in the general dispute chapter are available for labor disputes, but only after the procedures in the labor chapter have been exhausted. Another question policymakers dealing with labor and trade might have is how many RTAs allow for the establishment of a panel to settle labor disputes? Here, it is important to note that our database does not differentiate between panel of experts and arbitration panel. To understand whether it is one or the other, you will have to consult the text, which you can do directly from the text table. That said, to find out, we click on Panel. 43 RTAs provide for the establishment of a panel for labor disputes. How many of these 43 RTAs also provide for sanctions following, where applicable, a panel report? We click on Remedies, and we can deselect compliance plans if we want to look strictly for sanctions, because plans are not sanctions, strictly speaking. We see that the number goes down to 25 RTAs. Finally, many of you will probably be interested in obtaining information, including official documents, on labor disputes that have been activated so far. Is this possible with the LP Hub? Once again, it is. We click on cases triggered under dispute settlement. And we find 4 RTAs. If we expand, for example, CAFTA-DR, we find all links to official documents covering US, Guatemala, and other labor disputes under the agreement. We also regularly update these documents. So this is the end of our demonstration of the LP Hub. To conclude, we would like to remind you that the About page, accessible from this button on top, contains detailed information about the key features and functions of the LP Hub and allows you to access the methodology paper down here, as well as the video that was shown to you at the beginning of the session here. Thank you for your attention, and we welcome all questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Gaia. Ira, excellent demonstration of the LP Hub. We now move into the Q&A section of our session. So please, once again, if you would like to ask anything to our speakers today, just don't hesitate to drop it in the Q&A. I'm going to start with a question we received from Isabella Mancini. So her question is, what is the rationale of labor rights provisions? Is it triggering a change in the partner country, which uses trade agreements as a vehicle, the theoretical carrot, or is it to make sure that trade agreements do not have an adverse impact on labor standards? She says that this latter view is neglected all the time. I drop this to the floor if anyone would like to take this one on.
I can jump in here. Thank you, Isabella, for your question. And I see there, in fact, was a little bit more to it. And just to say, I was being a bit provocative in the early part of my presentation when I said that about 80% use Google. About 80% use Google to search for the trade agreement. Then normally they would do a Control F and search through the trade agreement. So I was just being a bit, trying to stimulate a little bit of thinking there. But to answer your question, I think it's a little bit of both. In fact, I think they're used both as a trigger for advancing labor rights and also as a way to level the playing field between trading partners. And it's in certain countries, it's normally it's advocated by trade union organizations in specific countries, specifically for that reason. I would think you said, what is the rationale for including labor provisions? I think each country has its rationale, and I think that rationale is outlined in its trade policy. So I wouldn't give a blanket reason for why some countries include labor provisions in their trade agreements. As you would see, the language tends to be different. So, for some, it's more about cooperation between countries. For others, it's about upholding labor standards. So for the most part, we would consider in terms of inclusive trade. And you see these patterns in terms of, for example, US, Canada, and the EU. A lot of labor provisions references are made, for example, in trade policy to have an inclusive trade. But what inclusive trade means for each trading partner can be something a bit different. So without going into too much detail there, I think one would really have to drill down a little bit into the trade partners policy to get a better understanding of why they include labor provisions.
Thanks, Marva. We have another question from Elizabeth Prosser, which resonates actually with a question from MSCO. This is more regarding the hub itself. Is there some form of word association list available for users who may not know to search, for example, employers rather than social partners?
I can take this one. So I would actually like to reply to both questions. First one, agreements do use a wide variety of terms, even to indicate, for example, social partners. So during the course of our demo, we saw that based on previous searches conducted by our team, if we are trying to get a broad picture of how agreements reference social partners, it is best to look for employers, because that is typically where mentions of social partners come in, when employers are mentioned together with workers. But of course, this is not exhaustive, precisely because of the variety of language adopted by all RTAs. So indeed, if you conduct a very precise research about, for example, engagement of social partners, you will have to search a variety of words through the search table or other functions. And this is why we are planning to produce, indeed, in the future, a sort of word association list, a keywords list that users can take inspiration from or search directly across the database. This is something that we are planning for the near future.
Thank you, Gaia. We have another question from Isabella Mancini. She asks, is it possible to check whether a trade agreement includes a regulatory cooperation chapter, which envisages regulatory cooperation activities on labor standards, for example, CETA?
You can take this one, Alessandra. Yeah, I think indeed we do include in the database the names of the chapters and the articles included of labor provisions. So I think the search box we indicated could help in order to identify easier the regulatory cooperation chapters. Indeed, we did include that, as well as the annexes, which very often we find the regulatory cooperation activities. So yeah, I think that would be the answer.
Thank you, Ira. Another question from Margaret Lyle. Once a meeting has taken place, a complaint has been filed, a paper has been published, etc., how soon will it appear on the site?
I can take this one. So we are still we're still discussing the official timeline for updates, but in general, we will try to keep the updated as regular as possible. So it might be a question of weeks. How long? We're still under discussion. And once we will have decided a timeline, we will publish it on the paper, so the users will know for sure how long they might have to wait on average to see new updates being reflected inside the hub. And I also see a question by Samantha Tate, also concerning disputes. And yes, the hub does house information about disputes, cases, petitions raised under different trade agreements. You have seen that for now the hub includes 4, but the more updates come in, and perhaps the more we manage to get from governments, the more pages might end up getting published in next years will be reflected inside the hub.
Thank you, Gaia.
Make a follow-up point here, Alessandro. Just
Please go ahead, Marva.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what my colleague Gaia said with respect to the updates of the database. Right now, we're thinking of a quarterly update. It may be a little more in the beginning, just because there are some recent updates of the WTO database, and they may put some more back in for 2021, and we want to make sure that we get all of those trade agreements in. And as a result of some consultations with people who have already reached out to us about reviewing some specific trade agreements for labor provisions. So we may see some update sooner than the next quarter. In addition, what we include in the database are the links to the documents on the country's website. So, we first need the country to update their website and for the information to be made available. And then once that information is available, we'll do our best to get into the database as soon as possible.
Thank you, Marva. Let me perhaps ask a question regarding the hub that I think echoes something we received in the chat. A question from Lady Silva. We'd like to know, can the data be downloaded in different formats?
I can take this question. Indeed, we can download. We offer 2 downloading options, features, one in PDF for the text of trade agreement, as well as the full Excel files. We are envisioning in the future to also have the filtered Excel data, but for now it's the full data in the Excel file as well. As well as the pictures of the figures and the map.
Excellent. Thank you, Ira. Let me jump to a question from Omar Burgan. Does the ILO ever recommend or highlight ideal or model language, excuse me, for strengthening labor standards in trade agreements?
Oops, I'll take that one. If a member comes to us with a request to provide support in the chapter of the trade agreement, the ILO provides support. However, the ILO doesn't suggest references unsolicited to partners of trade agreements, and the ILO is not involved in negotiation of trade agreements. The ILO would only respond to requests for technical advice and giving information to our to specific trading partners. But as you notice, the text in trade agreements with respect to labor provisions is different among trading partners. It's quite, countries have their templates, and this information is discussed at times with the ILO. But for the most part, it's countries who make that decision.
Thank you, Marwa. We have a question from Brian Burkett. He asks, what is the method to provide the team with new developments that we would like to share for possible inclusion and updated editions? This is concerning the hub.
Yeah, if you go to the About page, in fact, on the Labor Provisions Hub, there is an email address, and we'll put it in the chat as well. And you can just contact us directly through that email address, and someone will get back to you. And we're really looking forward to receiving those.
Thank you, Marwa. I had a question in mind. Maybe I missed an answer, but I would like to know, do you provide documents from all countries or just the US and the EU? And what about other languages?
I can take this one. We do provide documents from all countries, including documents in languages that are not English. Again, I echo what Marwa said. We need the countries first to publish these documents on their governmental pages, and then we will link to them in the LP Hub. Again, in case you realize that the LP Hub does not contain pages or documents that have been published by the relevant governments, especially if these are in a language that's not English, please again contact us at our email, lphub@ilo.org, and let us know. We will include the documents in the database.
Thank you, Gaia. It's very clear. We do have someone that is asking to take the floor, Martin Bulla. I will hand you the floor in case you wanted to ask a question. Oh, he disappeared. He changed his mind. Okay. Well, I don't see any further questions. I don't know if anybody would like to make any additional comments while we close out this session. Okay, I see a question come in. We have a question from Michael Vinograd. He asks, is specific information, for example, clauses related to C-190 or other international labor standards, retrievable from the hub?
I would say only in as much as it's referred to in the labor obligation or cooperative part of the trade agreement. So you'd have to do a specific search for this in the database and see what type of information is available. I would say specifically under the labor obligations.
Thank you, Marwa. All right, then I don't see any further comments or questions. Perhaps let me take this opportunity to thank everyone for joining us today. We will be providing all attendees with all relevant resources and links after this webinar is concluded. We do have a hub for a homepage for the LP Hub, and so please stay tuned for all upcoming news on this topic, and we're very excited to keep in touch and continue our collaboration. So thank you all, and thank you to the team for putting this together.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.